Something has been watching my family since before I was born. Before my father was born, but before my grandfather built the house where it all started. This isn't folklore passed down and embellished. It's documented, witnessed, repeated across 6 decades by people who never asked for it and couldn't escape it no matter how far they ran. My grandfather saw it first in 1963. My father in the 1980s. I've seen it myself in the 2000s and again in the 2010s. The same creature, the same studying gaze, the same impossible silence across 60 years until it wasn't silent anymore. What I'm about to tell you turned my family into prisoners after dark, made our home into a watchtower, and destroyed the one belief that had kept us sane through decades of fear, that it was only watching. My grandfather was 42 in the autumn of 1963 when he saw something standing in the North Woods that made him stop hunting for 3 years. He wasn't a man given to imagination. He'd worked as a timber surveyor in northern Michigan since his 20s, walked those forests in every season, knew the difference between a black bear on hind legs and a man in the distance. He could identify animal tracks in snow from 30 feet and told you what the creature had been doing, where it was headed, how long ago it had passed. The thing he saw that October evening was none of the animals he knew. He'd been walking back to his truck just before dusk, rifle slung over his shoulder, when movement in his peripheral vision made him turn toward a dense stand of white pine about 60 yards off. The light was failing but not gone. He saw it clearly. It stood upright, not rearing up the way a bear will before dropping back to all fours. Standing, comfortably, the way a man stands when he's waiting for someone. The body was wrong for a bear. Too narrow through the torso, too long in the limbs. The head was worse, distinctly canine. He described it in the one detailed conversation he ever had about that night as wolf-shaped but larger, set on a neck too thick and muscular for any wolf he'd seen in 40 years of Michigan woods. It was watching him, not the blank stare of an animal that's noticed emotion. This was focused, intentional, the same way you watch someone when you're trying to figure out what they'll do next. My grandfather stood frozen, his hand moving to the rifle strap without thinking. The creature didn't move, didn't drop to 4 legs, didn't turn away, didn't startle. It simply stood there in the deepening shadows between the pines, its body angled slightly toward him, and watched. He estimated later it had been 7 feet tall, maybe more. The proportions were human enough to be unmistakable as bipedal, alien enough to be unmistakable as not human. The arms were too long, hanging past where a man's would end. He couldn't see the hands clearly in the failing light, but remembered thickness at the ends of those arms, something heavier than paws. The encounter lasted less than 2 minutes. My grandfather finally took 3 slow steps backward, keeping his eyes on the tree line. The shape didn't follow. When he turned and walked quickly back to his truck, he didn't run, but it said later his body wanted to. He drove home, ate dinner with my grandmother, said nothing. 3 weeks later, he told his hunting partner he'd seen something strange in the woods and didn't plan to go back to that section for a while. His partner asked what he'd seen. My grandfather said, something that stood like a man, but wasn't one. The conversation ended there. He didn't report it, didn't call the Department of Natural Resources, didn't tell the story at the bar in town, didn't write it down. In a community of loggers, hunters, and farmers, where your reputation was built on practical reliability, claiming you'd seen a wolfman in the woods was a fast way to become the subject of jokes that would follow you for years. But he told his children, years later in the form of a rule, don't go to the North Woods after dark. When my father asked why, my grandfather's answer was always the same. Because I said so. It wasn't until my father was 16 that my grandfather gave him a real answer, and even then, it came as a warning, not a story. They were standing in the driveway at dusk, my father about to leave for a friend's house on the far side of the county. My grandfather put a hand on the truck door before my father could close it. If you're driving back late and you see something standing on two legs at the side of the road, don't stop. Don't slow down. Don't try to figure out what it is. My father laughed, thought it was a joke about hitchhikers. My grandfather didn't laugh. I'm not talking about a person. That's when he described what he'd seen in 1963. Not in detail, just enough. A shape that stood upright where nothing should stand upright. A sense of being assessed by something with intention behind its eyes. The wrongness of its proportions. My father asked if he'd ever seen it again. My grandfather paused. Then, "No, but I felt it watching." He never elaborated on that. Never explained whether he meant once, occasionally, or often. Never said whether the feeling came in the woods or somewhere else. He died in 1998. The last conversation I had with him, I was 12 years old and didn't know enough to ask the questions I'd later wish I had. But the warning he gave my father became a rule in our family long before I understood why. Don't go to the North Woods after dark. By the time I was old enough to push back on that rule, I'd already learned it wasn't about the woods. It was about what watched from them. For 20 years after my grandfather's sighting, the thing in the tree line became family folklore. Not the kind you tell at reunions, the kind you whisper as a caution. My father grew up with a single unbreakable rule that had no explanation attached until he was old enough to be trusted with the truth. Stay out of the North Woods after dark. When he was young, he assumed it was about getting lost. Or maybe poachers. Michigan forests are dense enough to disorient experienced hikers, and in the 1970s, the woods near their property saw occasional trouble with illegal hunting. The real reason sat unspoken until that conversation in the driveway when my father was 16. After my grandfather finally told him what he'd seen, my father did what most teenagers would do. He didn't believe it. Not fully. He believed his father had seen something. He believed it had frightened a man who didn't frighten easily. But a wolf standing upright like a man, that belonged in campfire stories, not in the woods his father had surveyed for decades. My father filed it away as a misidentification his grandfather had never fully shaken. A bear at a strange angle, a trick of failing light, the brain filling in gaps with something that made no sense because the truth, whatever it was, had been obscured by distance and dusk. He didn't argue. He accepted the warning, the way you accept any parental caution that seems unlikely but harmless to follow. He avoided the North Woods at night, not out of fear, but out of respect. The family never spoke about it openly. My grandmother knew, my father was sure of that, but she never brought it up, and my grandfather never mentioned it again after that single conversation. It existed in the space between acknowledged and unacknowledged, a story that wasn't quite real enough to defend, but too specific to forget. What my father didn't know until much later was that the sighting in 1963 fit a pattern far older and wider than one man's encounter in northern Michigan. The creature my grandfather described wasn't an anomaly, it was an archetype. Reports of wolf-headed beings walking upright appear throughout Native American oral history in the Great Lakes region, though the tribes who speak of them do so carefully. The Ojibwe have stories of malevolent shapeshifters. The Potawatomi reference creatures that walk the boundary between animal and something else. These aren't metaphorical teaching stories. They're warnings about specific things seen in specific places. European settlers began documenting similar sightings as early as the 1700s, though those accounts were often dismissed as frontier superstition or misidentified wildlife. By the 20th century, the phenomenon had a modern name, Dogman. The term sounds almost casual, like a comic book character, but the consistency of the reports is anything but casual. Witnesses across decades and states describe the same unnatural features my grandfather saw. A canine head, most often wolf-like, though some reports describe features closer to a large dog or even a hyena, set atop a muscular, bipedal body standing between 6 and 8 feet tall. The torso is humanoid in shape, but broader, built for power rather than speed. The arms are disproportionately long, ending in clawed hands capable of grasping, not just swiping. It's the hands that separate Dogman reports from misidentified bears. Bears have paws, blunt, wide, padded. Witnesses describe the Dogman's extremities as something else. Fingers, elongated, tipped with claws, articulated enough to grip. But the detail that appears most frequently, the one that unsettles witnesses long after the sighting ends, is the eyes. Not glowing, not red. That's Hollywood. Real witnesses talk about eyes that reflect light the way an animal's do, but that carry something behind the reflection. Awareness, focus, intent. My grandfather used the word studied. He said the creature looked at him, the way a man looks at something he's trying to figure out. Not prey behavior, not threat assessment, curiosity. That's the detail that doesn't fit the biological explanations. A wolf doesn't study, a bear doesn't assess. If the Dogman is an undiscovered animal, it's an animal that thinks. The Great Lakes region, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, has the highest concentration of Dogman reports in North America. Those sightings have been documented as far south as Texas and as far west as Colorado. Michigan alone has hundreds of documented accounts, many clustered in the northern part of the state, where dense forests meet low human population. My grandfather's sighting occurred just outside the small town of Traverse City, near the Manistee National Forest. That area has produced dozens of similar reports over the last 60 years. Though most witnesses, like my grandfather, never made official statements. Research into the phenomenon didn't begin in earnest until the 1980s, when Wisconsin author Linda S. Godfrey started investigating sightings near Elkhorn after multiple witnesses reported a wolf-headed figure walking along rural roads. Her work brought the phenomenon into the public eye, but it also revealed how many people had been sitting on their stories for years, sometimes decades, waiting for someone else to say it first. Fear of ridicule is the most common reason for silence. My grandfather wasn't unique in that. In small communities where reputation is built on reliability and practical skill, claiming you saw a monster is social suicide. You become the person who lost it, the one who can't be trusted to assess a situation clearly. So witnesses stay quiet. They tell a spouse maybe, a close friend, a child years later in the form of a warning that doesn't include the full story. That's how the secret moved through our family, not as a tale, but as a rule. My father followed the rule without understanding its weight. He stayed out of the North Woods after dark. He dismissed the story as a strange moment in his father's otherwise unremarkable life. And then, in 1984, he saw it himself. I need to tell you what happened to Michael, the grandfather's son, because it's when the family realized they weren't dealing with a singular event or a man's isolated madness. This was something else entirely. Michael was 34 in 1984. He'd heard his father's story exactly twice. Once as a teenager when he'd pressed the old man after too many beers at a cousin's wedding, and once more on his father's deathbed 3 years earlier, when the dying man had gripped his wrist and said, "It's still out there. It knows us." Michael had nodded, humored him, written it off as morphine confusion. He and his wife, Karen, bought 40 acres in Wexford County, Michigan, about 15 miles from where his father had lived. Different land, different decade. He worked as an electrician. She taught elementary school. Their daughter Emma was 7. They had a trampoline in the yard, a mortgage they could manage, and a life that felt blessedly normal. The first time Michael saw it, he was carrying a bag of trash to the burn barrel just after sunset on a Saturday in late September. He stopped mid-step. Something stood at the wood line, maybe 60 yards out, where the mowed lawn gave way to dense jack pine and oak. Upright, tall, well over 6 feet, closer to 7. Broad through the shoulders in a way that didn't match a man's proportions. Michael's first thought, absurdly, was that someone was wearing a costume. A hunter in a ghillie suit, maybe, though it wasn't rifle season. But the way it stood, perfectly motionless, head slightly tilted, sent a cold shock of recognition through him, before his conscious mind could catch up. He'd heard this posture described before, his father's voice, like it was thinking, like it was deciding. Michael dropped the trash bag. The sound of the plastic hitting gravel felt too loud. The figure didn't move. He backed toward the house without turning around, watching it the entire way. And when he reached the porch and finally blinked, it was gone. He didn't tell Karen. Not that night. He saw it again 4 days later, then a week after that. Then 3 nights in a row, always at dusk, always at the wood line, sometimes in the same spot, sometimes farther north along the property edge. It never approached, never made a sound, just stood and watched with a patience that felt deliberate and intelligent and completely wrong. Michael started timing his evenings to avoid being outside after dark. He told Karen he'd been having trouble sleeping, which was true. He'd lie awake listening to the house settle, waiting for the sound of something testing the doors. By mid-October, he'd admitted it to himself. This was the same thing his father had seen. He didn't know how that was possible. His father's sightings had been 30 miles away. Dogmen, if that's what this was, were supposed to be territorial, like wolves or bears, tied to a region. But unless 2 of these things existed in the same part of northern Michigan, separated by decades, the explanation was worse. It had followed them, or it had known where to find them. Michael broke his silence in early November, sitting at the kitchen table with Karen after Emma had gone to bed. He told her everything, his father's encounters, his own sightings, the sick certainty that they were dealing with the same creature. Karen listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I've seen it too." Michael felt the floor drop. She'd seen it twice, she told him. Once from the upstairs bathroom window while brushing her teeth. Once from the car when she'd come home late from a parent-teacher conference. Both times at the wood line. Both times she'd convinced herself it was a shadow, a trick of the light, her mind making shapes out of darkness. But it wasn't. "What do we do?" Karen asked. Michael didn't have an answer. They considered calling the police. But what would they report? A tall figure that stands in the woods and doesn't break any laws? They'd gone over it a dozen times. There were no tracks the next morning, no scat, no disturbed ground. It was as if the thing left no physical proof of its existence, only the certainty in the people who'd seen it. Emma saw it on Thanksgiving weekend. She'd been playing in the yard that afternoon, and when Michael called her in for dinner, she asked, casually, the way children ask things, why the big dog man was always watching their house. Michael's blood went cold. "When did you see him, sweetheart?" "Lots of times," Emma said, pulling off her boots. "He's there at night mostly, by the trees." Karen looked at Michael across the kitchen. Her face had gone pale. That was the moment, I think, when they understood the scope of it. This wasn't a one-time sighting or a shared hallucination. This was sustained, repeated. A pattern that had been quietly establishing itself while they'd tried to ignore it. And if Emma could see it, if a 7-year-old child was being watched by something that had stalked her grandfather before she was born, then the nightmare wasn't just theirs anymore. It was generational. Michael and Karen made the decision to move in February of 1985, 5 months after the sightings began. They didn't tell their families why. They cited work opportunities and better schools, plausible reasons that didn't invite questions. Karen's parents helped with a down payment. Michael's mother said she was sad to see them go, but understood. No one suspected they were running. They found a house in Kalkaska County, 43 miles southwest of their old property, closer to town. Streetlights, neighbors within shouting distance. The backyard bordered a golf course, not wilderness. It felt safe in a way their old home never had, not even in daylight. The woods had been the problem, Michael told himself. Too much isolation, too much darkness pressing in from all sides. A creature like that, whatever it was, couldn't operate near people, near noise and light and traffic. Territorial animals didn't follow prey into populated areas. They moved in March. Spring came. Emma started second grade at a new school and made friends quickly. Karen got a position teaching fourth grade in the district. Michael picked up contract work within a 20-mile radius. Life resumed. For 7 months, nothing happened. Michael stopped checking the windows before bed. Karen slept through the night. Emma forgot about the Dogman entirely, the way children forget most things when new routines replace old ones. They didn't talk about why they'd really moved. The subject became a silent agreement between them, something they'd escaped and didn't need to revisit. By October, Michael had almost convinced himself that it had been environmental after all. A bear, perhaps, glimpsed in bad light and distorted by his father's stories into something it wasn't. The mind makes patterns. Fear makes monsters. They'd overreacted, but it didn't matter now. They were safe. Then Emma asked why the Dogman had found them again. It was a Saturday morning. Karen was making pancakes. Michael was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. Emma was coloring at the counter, legs swinging from the bar stool. She said it without looking up, the same casual tone she'd used before. Matter of fact, a child reporting something observed, not understood. "When?" Michael asked. His voice stayed level through sheer will. "Last night," Emma said. "He was by the fence, near the big tree." Karen turned from the stove. The spatula in her hand was shaking. Michael walked to the sliding glass door and looked out at the backyard. The fence she'd mentioned separated their property from the golf course. A large oak stood just inside the fence line, maybe 50 feet from the house, plenty close enough to see through the windows. "Emma," Karen said quietly, "can you describe what you saw?" Emma shrugged, still coloring. "Same as before. Really tall. He stands funny. Like people stand, but not." Michael felt something crack open inside his chest. A kind of airless panic he hadn't felt since childhood. They hadn't taught Emma the details. She'd never heard the term bipedal. She didn't know what her grandfather had seen or how he'd described it. But her words matched perfectly. That night, after Emma was asleep, Michael sat on the back porch with a spotlight and a hunting rifle across his lap. He stayed there until 3 a.m., sweeping the beam across the yard every few minutes, seeing nothing but grass and shadow and the dark line of the fence. At 3:17 a.m., the motion sensor light on the side of the house clicked on. Michael stood, heart hammering, and moved to the corner of the porch where he could see the side yard. The light illuminated a narrow strip of grass between the house and the neighbor's fence. Empty now, but something had triggered the sensor. He waited. The light turned off after 60 seconds of no movement. 30 seconds later, it clicked on again. This happened 4 more times over the next 10 minutes. On, off, on, off. Something was moving just outside the sensor's reliable range, testing it, learning the boundaries. Michael raised the rifle and aimed at nothing, because there was nothing visible to aim at. He stood there in the cold, breath fogging, waiting for a target that wouldn't show itself. When the light finally stayed off, he went inside, locked every door and window, and sat awake in the living room until sunrise. He saw it himself 2 weeks later. He was driving home from a job site just after sunset, about 3 miles from the house, when he passed a figure standing on the shoulder of the road, tall, upright, facing the street. Michael's foot hit the brake without conscious thought. The truck slowed. He looked in the rearview mirror. The figure turned its head to follow the truck's movement. Smooth, tracking. Michael accelerated and didn't look back again. When he got home, he told Karen everything. They sat together in the locked bedroom and spoke in low voices so Emma wouldn't hear. And for the first time, they said the thing they'd both been avoiding since the day they'd moved. It hadn't been about the land, it had been about them. Some animals are territorial. They defend a hunting ground, a den, a range. You leave their territory and they leave you alone. But some things aren't tied to a place. Some things attach. The realization settled over them like a weight. 43 miles, a new town, a new home surrounded by people and light. None of it had mattered. The creature had found them anyway. I was 23 the first time I saw it standing in our driveway, not at the tree line, where my grandfather swore he'd seen it in the 60s, not at the property edge, where my father had watched it for years in the 80s and 90s, in our driveway, 15 feet from the front door. This was 2008, October, around 9:30 at night. I'd driven home from my shift at the hardware store, pulled in, killed the engine. The motion sensor light by the garage had triggered, flooding the gravel in harsh white light. I grabbed my phone and keys, opened the door, and froze. It stood between my truck and the house, 7 feet tall, maybe more, shoulders broader than any man's. The head was wrong, elongated, canine, but the eyes faced forward like a predator's, not set on the sides like a deer or a dog. Fur covered everything I could see, dark gray or brown, hard to tell in the artificial light. The arms hung too long, ending in hands that weren't quite hands and weren't quite paws. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me through the windshield. My grandfather had seen it once, maybe twice in his whole life, distant glimpses that he'd dismissed as tricks of failing eyesight and forest shadow until the encounters piled up too high to ignore. My father had seen it a dozen times over 20 years, always at a distance, always at the edges of our property. They were sightings, moments. This was different. I sat in my truck for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my dashboard, counting each minute, telling myself that if I waited long enough, it would leave, or I'd realize I was looking at a shadow, a deer, anything normal. The creature didn't move, didn't shift weight, didn't breathe that I could see. Finally, I laid on the horn. The noise shattered the silence. The creature turned its head, not with the quick, startled jerk of an animal, but with the slow deliberation of someone deciding whether to acknowledge an interruption, and walked away. Not ran, walked. It moved around the side of the garage and disappeared into the darkness beyond the reach of the motion light. I waited another 5 minutes before I sprinted to the front door. Inside, my father was in the living room, reading. He looked up when I came in, saw my face, and set the book down. "You saw it?" "Not a question." I nodded. "How close?" "Driveway." Something changed in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. Resignation, maybe. He was 51 then, his hair going gray, his hands scarred from decades of carpentry work. He'd carried this thing his whole adult life. The weight of knowing something impossible was real. The exhaustion of being watched by something that shouldn't exist. Now I carried it too. The sightings didn't stop. They accelerated. 3 nights later, I saw it standing at the living room window, face pressed close to the glass, breath fogging the pane. I'd been watching television, alone in the house. I caught the movement in my peripheral vision, turned my head, and met its eyes through the window. Yellow gold, reflective like a dog's in headlights, but the intelligence behind them was nothing like a dog's. I didn't move, didn't scream. My body had locked up completely, every muscle rigid. It stayed there for maybe 30 seconds, studying me. Then it stepped back and vanished into the dark. I installed motion sensor lights on every side of the house the next week. 9 of them, high wattage LEDs that would flood the yard and light at the slightest movement. The first night after installation, they triggered 17 times between sunset and dawn. I checked the footage from the security camera I'd mounted by the back door. 16 of the 17 triggers showed nothing. Trees swaying, shadows moving. One showed a raccoon. The 17th showed something tall, moving past the frame. Too fast to make out the detail, just a blur of motion and a glimpse of fur. I tried everything. Trail cameras positioned in the woods at the property line. A better security system with 4 cameras covering every approach to the house. I kept my phone charged and ready, camera app open, every time I went outside after dark. The trail cameras captured thousands of images. Deer, coyotes, possums. One black bear. Never the creature, though I knew it was out there. I'd see it, myself, then check the camera the next day. Nothing. The security footage was worse. Cameras would malfunction at crucial moments, recording static or going black for 30-second intervals. Twice, the entire system reset itself overnight, wiping 12 hours of footage. The company sent a technician who found nothing wrong with the equipment. I started reading about similar cases. Thousands of them, scattered across North America, concentrated in Michigan, Wisconsin, and the northern forests. People who'd seen the same thing I'd seen, who'd tried to capture proof and failed in the same inexplicable ways. Researchers had a term for it, the Oz factor, a bubble of distorted reality that surrounds certain phenomena. Where technology fails, time seems to stretch or compress, and the normal rules stop applying. Witnesses describe feeling dreamlike, detached, as if the encounter exists in a space separate from ordinary experience. I didn't feel detached. I felt hyper-aware. Every sound, outside after dark, made my pulse spike. Every shadow that moved wrong sent adrenaline flooding through my system. My father had learned to live with it, had spent decades integrating the impossible into his daily life until it became almost routine. I couldn't do that. Maybe because the creature was closer now, bolder. Maybe because I'd grown up in a world with internet and smartphones and the assumption that everything could be documented, proven, shared. The worst part wasn't the fear, it was the isolation. I couldn't talk about it. My friends would think I was losing my mind. My coworkers would laugh, or worse, look at me with pity. I'd tried once, carefully, to mention it to my girlfriend, framed it as a family story, something my grandfather used to talk about. She'd smiled and said it sounded like a creepy campfire tale. I never brought it up again. We broke up 4 months later. She said I'd become distant, that I never wanted to go out at night anymore, that I seemed paranoid. She wasn't wrong. My father and I didn't talk about it much, even though we both knew. What was there to say? The creature was real. It had been watching our family for 60 years. We had no idea why, no idea what it wanted, no way to make it stop. He told me once, late at night after we'd both seen it standing at the edge of the woods, that his father had died without ever understanding what it was. He'd spent his final years thinking maybe he'd had early dementia, that the sightings were hallucinations brought on by a failing brain. At least he knew you'd seen it too, I said. Before he died, at least he knew he wasn't crazy. My father nodded. And now you know I'm not crazy. What about when I'm old? I asked. What if I have kids? Does this thing just keep going? He didn't have an answer. The creature appeared by the road one night in November, 3 months after that first driveway encounter. I'd been driving home, same route I always took, and there it was standing on the shoulder 20 feet ahead, fully illuminated in my headlights. I slammed the brakes. The truck skidded, stopped 15 feet away. The creature didn't move. It stood there in the full glare of my high beams, utterly unbothered, and stared directly at me through the windshield. Its face was fully visible for the first time. Elongated snout, lips pulled back slightly to show teeth, ears pointed and alert. The eyes reflected gold, unblinking. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I couldn't reach for my phone, couldn't move at all. It watched me for what felt like an eternity but was probably 30 seconds. Then it turned and walked into the forest, moving with the casual confidence of something that knew I was no threat. I sat in my truck in the middle of the empty road for 10 minutes before I could make my foot press the gas pedal. That night, I understood what my grandfather and father had lived with. Not just fear, though there was plenty of that, but the suffocating weight of knowing something impossible, of carrying knowledge that isolated you from everyone who hadn't seen it, of living in a reality that diverged from the one everyone else inhabited. The creature had been watching my family since before I was born. It had followed us across miles when we moved. It had outlasted my grandfather and showed no signs of losing interest in my father or me. After 60 years, it was still here, still watching, still waiting, and I had no idea what it wanted. The trail camera cost me $200. Commercial grade, designed for serious hunters, with infrared night vision, and a trigger speed fast enough to capture a running deer mid-stride. I mounted it on an oak tree at the northern edge of our property, aimed at the spot where I'd seen the creature standing 3 times in the previous 2 weeks. Set the sensitivity high, the photo interval tight. The instruction manual promised it could capture even small animals in complete darkness. I checked it every morning for 7 days. 463 photos. Deer, raccoons, a fox, one confused-looking turkey. 3 photos showed nothing but trees. 1 showed me walking to check the camera. 0 showed the creature I'd watched stand in that exact spot for 20 minutes on day 3. I know it was there. I'd seen it from the kitchen window while making coffee, standing motionless in the pre-dawn darkness. I'd watched it for as long as I could, before the creeping sensation of being studied made me back away from the window. The camera had been running the entire time. I checked the timestamp on the photos. The sequence went 6:47 a.m., deer passing through. 6:51 a.m., nothing visible. 6:59 a.m., me approaching the tree. I'd watched the creature from 6:52 to 7:08, 16 minutes. The camera had somehow skipped those 16 minutes entirely. I tried video after that. My phone first, then a dedicated camcorder my father had bought in the 90s that still worked. Neither helped. The phone footage was the worst. I'd see the creature standing at the tree line, unlock my phone, open the camera app, and the moment I lifted it to record, the app would freeze or the phone would crash entirely. Twice the phone shut itself off completely despite being fully charged. The one time I managed to capture 30 seconds of footage, the file corrupted when I tried to transfer it to my computer. Every recovery program I tried returned the same error. File format unrecognizable. Data irretrievable. My father had been through this 3 decades earlier. He'd bought one of the first consumer camcorders in 1985, convinced he'd finally document what he'd been seeing. Over 2 years, he'd tried to film the creature 11 times. He got footage twice. Both tapes degraded within weeks, developing tracking errors and static that made them unwatchable. He'd kept them anyway, stored carefully in a climate-controlled case. I'd looked at them once. The static had consumed everything. The security system I'd installed went wrong in different ways. The cameras worked perfectly most of the time. Crisp footage, reliable motion detection, no glitches. Then the creature would appear, and the system would develop sudden, inexplicable problems. Cameras would angle themselves slightly away from where the creature stood, as if something had physically adjusted them, though the mounts showed no signs of tampering. Footage would record perfectly, but play back as a black screen. Motion sensors would fail to trigger, then work flawlessly 10 minutes later. The most unsettling malfunction happened in January. I'd been watching television when the living room camera's feed popped up on my phone, the motion alert notification. I opened the app and saw the creature standing in our front yard, 15 feet from the window, staring directly at the camera. The image was perfect, crystal clear, well lit by the motion sensor lights, no ambiguity. I was looking at high-definition footage of something that shouldn't exist. I hit record on my phone to capture the screen. The app crashed immediately. When I reopened it, the live feed showed an empty yard. I checked the saved footage from the camera itself. The moment where I'd seen the creature had been replaced by 3 seconds of black screen. The footage before and after played normally. I wasn't the only one experiencing this. I'd spent months reading encounter reports by then, hundreds of them, trying to find patterns or explanations. The documentation problem appeared everywhere. A man in Wisconsin had seen the creature on his property 40 times over 2 years. He'd attempted to photograph it on 23 occasions using 5 different cameras. He'd captured one blurry image that could have been anything. Every other attempt had failed. Dead batteries and fresh cameras, memory cards that refused to save files, photos that came out as blank white, screens. A woman in northern Michigan had installed a comprehensive security system after repeated encounters. The system worked perfectly for months. The night she saw the creature walk across her driveway, all 6 cameras went offline simultaneously for 45 seconds. The company found no technical explanation. Researchers called it the Oz factor. The term came from paranormal investigator Jenny Randles, who documented similar effects around UFO encounters, electronics malfunctioning, time distortion, a sense of unreality that surrounded the phenomenon like a protective bubble. The name referenced the Wizard of Oz, that moment when Dorothy realizes she's left normal reality behind and entered a place where different rules apply. Witnesses describe feeling exactly that way during encounters, disconnected from ordinary experience, trapped in a pocket of distorted reality where technology failed and certainty dissolved. I felt it every time, the dreamlike sensation that started the moment I saw the creature, the way time seemed to stretch or compress, the strange calm that settled over me despite the terror underneath. And always, the complete failure of any device that might have provided proof. The theories multiplied the more I researched. Some investigators believed the effect was technological, that the creature emitted some form of electromagnetic field that disrupted electronics. Others thought it was biological, a defense mechanism that had evolved specifically to prevent documentation. The more esoteric researchers argued it was evidence that the creature existed partially outside our normal reality, that it was interdimensional or paranormal, and the documentation failures were simply proof that cameras and electronics couldn't capture something that wasn't fully present in our physical world. None of the theories changed the result. Thousands of witnesses, thousands of encounters, decades of sightings across multiple states, and the physical evidence remained maddeningly elusive. A handful of ambiguous photos, questionable footprint casts, blurry videos that showed something large and upright moving through trees, but never clearly enough to silence skeptics. My father had made peace with it years ago. He'd stopped trying to capture proof, stopped worrying whether anyone believed him. The creature was real, regardless of whether he could prove it. I couldn't accept that. I was 24 years old, raised in a world where everything could be documented and shared instantly. The idea that something this significant could exist without proof felt fundamentally wrong. But after 8 months of failed attempts, after dozens of corrupted files and malfunctioning cameras and mysteriously missing footage, I started to understand what my father had learned through experience. The creature didn't want to be documented, or it couldn't be, or reality itself bent around it in ways that made documentation impossible. The why didn't matter. The effect was the same. I was living through encounters with something that thousands of people had seen but nobody could prove. I had clear memories, visceral fear, and a growing collection of broken technology. But I had no evidence that would convince anyone who hadn't experienced it themselves. The isolation that created was worse than the fear. I could handle being afraid. I'd learned to function with adrenaline, constantly simmering under my skin, with hypervigilance that never completely shut off. What I couldn't handle was knowing something true and impossible, carrying that knowledge alone, unable to share it in any meaningful way, because the one thing that might make people believe, clear, undeniable proof, remained forever out of reach. The creature had been observed by 3 generations of my family across 6 decades. It had been seen by thousands of other people across North America. It was real. It existed, and it had somehow remained, invisible to the one thing that should have made its existence undeniable, the camera lens. That realization, more than anything else, made me understand the true nature of what we were dealing with. This wasn't just an unknown animal. It was something that actively resisted documentation, that existed in the gaps between proof and belief, that remained perpetually on the edge of reality, where certainty dissolved. My grandfather had died without proving what he'd seen. My father had lived 50 years with the same frustration. Now it was mine. I kept trying anyway. I kept my phone charged, kept the cameras running, kept hoping that maybe this time would be different. But I knew better. Whatever this thing was, it had spent 60 years making sure it remained exactly what it had always been. Impossible to ignore and impossible to prove. 3 generations. 6 decades. One question they couldn't escape. What was it? The grandfather refused to speculate before he died, shutting down any conversation that moved past something I saw in the woods. But his son, now a man in his 50s, carrying his own years of sightings, couldn't live with silence anymore. He needed answers, even if they led nowhere. So he did what anyone would do in the 21st century. He searched. What he found was a phenomenon far larger than his family's private nightmare. Thousands of reports spanning Michigan, Wisconsin, and the northern forests. Witness accounts describing the same creature, 7 to 8 feet tall, bipedal, canine head, eyes that reflected light. Some called it Dogman. Others used older names. But the reports split sharply when it came to what it actually was. The first theory was the simplest. An undiscovered species. A rare bipedal canid that had somehow evaded scientific documentation, living in the deep wilderness where human contact was rare enough to remain a rumor. Large predators had been discovered before, new species catalogued in remote regions, even in modern decades. He wanted to believe that explanation. It was clean. It was rational. It didn't require him to abandon everything he understood about the world. But it didn't explain the intelligence, the way the creature watched them, not like a predator studying prey, but like something observing with intent. It didn't explain the electronics that failed at precisely the wrong moment, or the unshakable sensation that this thing existed slightly outside the normal rules. The second theory emerged from modern Dogman research circles, and it unsettled him more than the first. A paranormal entity, something interdimensional that slipped between realities, appearing and vanishing in ways that defied physical laws. Researchers pointed to the pattern of high strangeness surrounding sightings, malfunctioning equipment, time distortions, the eerie silence that descended before encounters. Some reports linked Dogman appearances to UFO activity or unexplained lights in the sky. Others described a sensation witnesses called the Oz factor, a bubble of unreality where normal physical rules seemed suspended, where sounds disappeared and the air itself felt wrong. His son had felt that, the night by the driveway when the creature stood 10 feet away and the world went silent. No wind, no insects, no ambient noise. Just the two of them locked in a moment that shouldn't have existed. But even the paranormal explanation felt incomplete. The third theory was older, much older. Native legends from the region spoke of malevolent shapeshifters, beings that wore the skins of animals and walked with dark purpose. The names varied by tribe, but the warning remained consistent. These were not animals, not spirits in the comforting sense, but something that violated the natural order. He researched carefully, aware he was stepping into cultural territory that wasn't his. The modern Dogman phenomenon, reported by people like his family, wasn't the same as these specific tribal beliefs, but the legends predated European contact by centuries, describing creatures whose behavior matched what they'd experienced. Intelligent, relentless, and bound to certain bloodlines or places for reasons no one could explain. What unnerved him most was that none of the theories fully worked. A biological animal didn't explain the electronics. A paranormal entity didn't explain the physical tracks left behind in snow and mud. Ancient legends didn't explain why his family specifically, across 3 generations and multiple locations, always miles apart. Unless the answer was some terrible combination of all 3. He stopped searching online after that thought took root. The forums and research sites became unbearable. Too many theories, too many people convinced they had the answer, too much speculation, built on too little evidence. But one question haunted him more than the identity of the creature itself. After 60 years of passive observation, standing at a distance, watching through trees, appearing and vanishing like something caught between states of being. Why would it change the pattern now? It happened on a Tuesday in late September. His daughter, the grandfather's great-granddaughter, 23 years old and tired of living in fear of her own driveway, had stayed late at a friend's house. She texted at 10:47 p.m. that she was heading home. He told her to call when she pulled in. She always did now. The call came at 11:04 p.m., but she wasn't speaking. He could hear her breathing, fast, shallow, panicked, and the sound of her car engine still running. "I'm in the driveway," she finally whispered. "It's here." He was already moving toward the door, phone pressed to his ear, telling her to stay in the car. "Lock the doors. Do not get out." "Dad," her voice cracked. "It's not hiding." The creature stood directly in her headlight beams, 15 feet from her front bumper, not at the tree line, not in shadow. Fully illuminated, fully visible, making no attempt to conceal itself. Just standing there, watching her through the windshield. She described it in fragmented bursts. The size, the posture, the eyes reflecting green in the halogen lights. Everything the family had reported for 60 years, now undeniable and lit up like a stage performance. He was outside now, sprinting down his own driveway 200 yards away, flashlight in hand, knowing it was useless but unable to stay inside. "Drive forward," he told her. Slowly, it'll move. I can't. You have to. She pressed the accelerator. The car rolled forward 3 feet. The creature didn't move. 5 feet. 10 feet. The bumper was 12 feet away now, the headlights washing over its torso, its legs, the impossible wrongness of its proportions. And then it made a sound. Not a howl, not a bark or growl or any noise that belonged to a wolf or dog or anything with 4 legs and a reasonable place in the natural order. It was a scream, low and guttural at first, vibrating through the car's frame, through her chest, through the air itself. Then it rose, higher, sharper, twisting into something that sounded like a human voice screaming through a wolf's throat. A fusion of 2 things that should never occupy the same space. She described it later as the worst sound she'd ever heard, not because it was loud, but because it was wrong in a way that bypassed thought and went straight to the part of the brain that knows when something violates the rules of reality. The scream lasted 4 seconds. Then the creature turned and walked, not ran, walked, off the driveway and into the darkness beyond the headlights' reach. Upright, steady, deliberate, gone. She sat in the driveway with the engine running until he reached her. When he pulled open the door, she was shaking so badly she couldn't unfasten her seatbelt. 60 years, 3 generations, hundreds of sightings. And in all that time, across all those encounters, the creature had never made a sound. Until now. It happened on a Tuesday in October, just after 9 p.m. The youngest member of the current generation, a 28-year-old IT specialist who'd grown up with his family's haunting as a grim fact of life, was returning home from a late shift. He pulled into the driveway, killed the engine, and sat for a moment, gathering himself. Coming home after dark had become a ritual of dread, every shadowed corner a potential hiding place. He stepped out of the car. The thing came from the tree line at a speed no living animal should possess. Not bounding, not loping, running upright like a man sprinting at Olympic velocity, but faster, impossibly faster, covering 40 yards in what felt like 2 heartbeats. He froze. Couldn't scream. Couldn't move. It stopped 10 feet away. Just stopped. Motionless. The security light caught its eyes. Amber reflecting like a wolf's, but set in a face that was all wrong. Its chest heaved once, deliberately, and that guttural sound came again, the one they'd first heard weeks earlier. Closer now, it vibrated through his rib cage like standing next to a subwoofer. Then it turned and walked. Not ran, walked. Back into the darkness with the calm of something that had made its point. The entire encounter lasted perhaps 8 seconds. It felt like an hour. This wasn't observation. This was a demonstration. The family doesn't go outside after sunset anymore. Not to take out trash. Not to move the car. Not for any reason. They installed motion-activated floodlights that turned their property into a stadium at the slightest movement, though the lights trip constantly with no visible cause. They keep curtains drawn at night, every night, because the thought of something looking in while they can't look out has become unbearable. The youngest family member moved back in with his parents. Living alone felt like offering himself up. The grandfather, now in his 80s, says very little about the bluff charge when asked. He just nods slowly, as if something he'd suspected for decades had finally been confirmed. "It wanted us to know," he said once. "All these years, it wanted us to understand what it could do. But understanding brings no comfort. Only new questions that have no answers. Why 60 years of silence, then sound? Why 60 years of distance, then aggression? What changed, in the creature or in them? The worst possibility, the one nobody speaks aloud but everyone thinks, maybe nothing changed at all. Maybe this was always where it was heading. Maybe 6 decades of watching was preparation for something none of them want to imagine. And the bluff charge wasn't an ending, but an announcement. A beginning. They still see it. Less frequently now, but that brings no relief. The absence feels like anticipation, like something holding its breath. Waiting for the next move in a game only it understands. With rules, only it knows, on a timeline measured not in days or years, but in the span of human generations. The family's story continues. Their stalker still watches. And after 60 years, they're no closer to understanding why it chose them, what it wants, or when, not if, the pattern will break again.